Okay, for those who don't know who I am, I'm Chris Coates, I'm from Lancaster. I have many hats I could wear, but I suppose the one I'm wearing here partly is I'm a carpenter by trade, and I've sort of worked around self-build, assisted self-build as a sort of carpenter. This is actually a beach house that I helped to build with a guy I used to work with, Peter Wilshaw, on the western shores of Morecambe Bay. John Sue's house.
Oh wow.
And I realised, like you do, when someone asks you to talk about something you don't really think you know very much about, you go, oh, actually, I have built a ton. I've built small houses, I've worked in self-build, and I just dreamed up this title so I could fit anything in, really. Because it's like one of those things, you say, I'll give a talk, and someone says, oh, talk about whatever you like, and you go, well, it's not very focused. And then, of course, somebody wants a title for your talk about whatever you like. So I thought this would cover pretty much anything I wanted to say. The other hat I'm wearing is I'm one of the editors of Diggers and Dreamers, which is I have been for 25 years, which is a directory, a journal about, and now a website about intentional communities of any sort across the UK. So this is the entertainment, and if we want to chat about anything else that might help get a tiny house group going, that's what I come for. I come for you to pick my brains, to be any help I can. This is the entertainment. So,
what's that involved in?
Baycliffe. So I thought I'd start with a story about a school friend of mine. When I was 12, a new lad came to our school in our class. His father had just got a job as the gravedigger in the local cemetery, and they'd got the cemetery house. But he told me stories about the previous winter when his father had been unemployed. They lived in what I can only describe as a sort of permanent tentage situation at this place called the Swiveland Camp. He lived in a series of 4 frame tents, which had wooden floors and were joined together by a series of canvas corridors. And they lived there for an entire winter because his father was unemployed, had been thrown out of their house. In about 1995, I was walking through, I'd forgotten all about this story that this mate of mine, Kevin, had told me. And I came across this place. It is now, I would say, des res chalets in a very heavily wooded area. There were 4 befores parked outside these chalets that had grown. This is a photo from the 1920s when it was set up. It was, I guess, part of the Plotlands era developments, and I'll come on to them later. But it had turned in 50 years from essentially somewhere that obviously was set up by and probably hand-built places, either as holiday homes or actual places to live, through being somewhere that people who had nowhere to live, homeless people, went and stayed, into rather posh sort of places to stay in the countryside. And so the point I'm trying to make is that people have tried tiny houses for centuries, actually. And if you go right back, this is a squatter cottage built in 1797, although that's not the building that was built in 1797. The building that was built in 1797 was timber, a timber hut. I don't know whether it was one of these fabled buildings that if you could build your house overnight on a piece of common land, you could basically claim squatters' rights. Colin Ward's written a book about that deals with that issue, Colin Ward, the anarchist writer. He says very hard to find any evidence of this mythological right that you have, that if you could get a house up between sort of dusk and dawn, you could stay in it. The records for this one are that in 1797, someone was paying a sort of ground rent to the lord of the manor to be able to stay there. It was a pittance, it didn't reflect probably the cost of building it, but it was like pence per year. But in an acknowledgement that he was a tenant of sorts. So, I'm just going to rattle through these. This is property that's now owned by the National Trust. It's interesting what happens to historic tiny houses. It's a Chartist cottage, Great Dogford, in Worcestershire. The Chartist land settlement project was an attempt to get working people settled on enough land that would get them the vote. This is part of the Chartist campaign for the vote. And I think if it was being done today, we would call it crowdfunding.
Right.
But essentially, there were these Chartist groups agitating all over the country for the vote. And in fact, an Irishman, Fergus O'Connor, who ran a radical newspaper, coordinated this project. And they did it by basically getting people to pay into a sort of savings club. And then when you'd reached a certain amount of savings and they'd collected enough money to buy an estate and divide it up into plots, build cottages. And there were about 7 estates bought, and they built 20 or 30 cottages on each one, a school. They provided you with an allotment, and essentially those people who paid up to a certain level were entered into a raffle. And what won was a tiny house. These were 3 rooms. There's 2 rooms either side of a sort of central room. There was some outbuildings at the back for keeping pigs and animals in. And certainly the first settlement was open to a great fanfare, parade with brass bands, and your gardens were already planted for you.
Mm.
They failed because it was a challenge to the way land was owned. And I don't know, it's not entirely clear to me, but Dorothy Thompson, the historian who's done a lot of work on the Chartists, said that basically the landowning aristocracy were not going to let this scheme succeed. And they basically said, are you a self-help project or are you a lottery? If you're a lottery, and they could never decide. And actually what happened was Fergus O'Connor ended up bankrolling the scheme because the legal status was never sorted out. But when I realised it was crowdfunded, essentially, by a wider group of people, and in fact, the first raffle was held in Manchester, at Cheetham Hill, and there's a script available of who won. So this is a tiny house from the longest existing intentional community in the UK, which is White Way in Gloucestershire, which was set up in 1898 and is still going. It's on the edge of the Cotswolds, just north of Stroud. A group of anarchists bought 40 acres of land split it up into plots, and it was entirely up to you to provide your accommodation on your initially 1 acre plots, although they then did get split up. And the founding mythology is that they were anarchists, they didn't believe in property ownership, so how do you buy a piece of land if you don't believe in property ownership? So the founding myth is that two of them bought it, stuck the deeds on a pitchfork and covered them in paraffin and burnt them. And if you ask them why they've survived for over 100 years, they say it's because nobody can prove they own anything. And what the idea was, and a lot of the early houses were just sheds, shacks, made out of turf and all sorts of things. This is quite a substantial building. I mean, it's only 4 years in, and someone's building what looks to me like a picture of a modern tiny house. And what was supposed to happen was when you wanted to leave, is you took your house down and took it with you. That didn't happen. So money exchanged hands for the shack, the very nice timber frame, timber cottage, and today you can't get a mortgage to move there because you only own the bricks and mortar, you don't own the land it stands on. So a penniless anarchist couldn't move in. There are some of buildings have been extended quite extensively, but they're still going. They still have their original structure. They have done everything that any commune or intentional community has ever done. They have a swimming pool, they have a village hall, they've run their own school, they've run their own craft workshops, all in 100 years. And the most striking thing if you visit is the entire place was not designed for the car. There is a road, a public road runs through it, but if you get off that, it's tiny. It was designed to walk. And the place I live now, we've gone back to keeping cars out of the site, and things have come full circle. It wasn't just crazy anarchists doing tiny houses. The sort of legit part of the sort of property development, the alternative property development, the Garden City movement, was trying to work out how to provide cheap housing, affordable rented housing at that point. This is an experimental house using the alternative building methods of the day, which is precast concrete. So this is a house that stood until the 1980s with somebody living in it.
It's concrete, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah, they tried to move it and the concrete disintegrated. They tried to move it to a sort of museum. But it was entered in by the concrete firm. The Daily Mail actually ran a competition to provide affordable cottage housing, and this was one of the entries in 1905. I'm not. I mean, this was sponsored by the concrete building firm, which brings us on to plotlands, which is what I was talking about before. In some ways, this is why we have a planning system. The authorities were so horrified at the idea of people going out and building their own houses that they essentially pulled together planning legislation. The plotland schemes were essentially farmers, landowners, deciding that it was more advantageous to them to divide their fields up, let people have little plots, and let them build their own house on it. And there are stories of people, there's a book called Arcadia for All by Dennis Hardy, people cycling out from London's East End down to plotlands in Essex and on the East Coast with building materials on the back of their bikes and slowly building their house at weekends or still working in the docks or whatever. And I've got an example of one of the, this is Jaywick Sands. It's one of the, it's just just by Clacton on Sea. This is one of the Plotland schemes. It has become notorious as, I'll show you the next slide, as the most deprived community.
Like a shanty town.
That's what it looks like today.
Yeah, I know it.
It has become, it is now, by official statistics, which the people of Jaywick are very upset by being deemed the most deprived community in the country.
Because it's the more richest part of the country.
Yeah, down on that southeast, yeah. It's a pocket of deprivation. A lot of the properties were empty and derelict, people abandoned them. And I mean, in some ways, this is a counterpoint to the White Way. What can happen to that sort of development? I would say the anarchists managed better than the private developers. This was a private development scheme, and the private developer then disappeared after he'd made his community. Not all the plotlands were sort of organised. You often get 2 or 3 down a street. There's some in the back of Blackburn. And they're buildings of all sorts. This is 2 railway carriages parked side by side and the roof stuck on it. Put there in the 1920s. It was for sale in 1987 for £50,000 as a building plot. Presumably it didn't cost that, 2 railway carriages. But someone was still living in it. Someone had lived in it until 1987. And this is probably the most famous Plotman's house. Is it Derek Jarman's house on the coast at Dungeness? This is now a tourist attraction because a famous person lived there, laid out an amazing garden on the beach, and yeah, you can go and visit. It's a bit like the Rosedene Cottage, the Chartist Cottage, which the National Trust have taken over.
He's had the money for a liquor town there, isn't he?
Yeah.
It is very, very nice.
Yes.
That's lovely.
I mean, compare that to what the slide about Jaywick. I mean, this is Desiree, and quite a lot of them on the Dungeness coast are very nice, even though it's pretty bleak. I mean, just off picture from the left is a Dirty Great Nuclear Power Station.
Yeah.
He's really used his native plant in there,
Yeah.
But I mean, you then get prefabs in the Second World War, meant to be very short-term accommodation. People ended up living in them for 20, 25 years, saying they were the best place they'd ever lived, and reluctant to move out for refurbishment. Some of them are, the basic structures are still in use. There's a small estate in Lancaster that essentially is a prefab estate that's been this again is at a museum, West Country Museum of Buildings. So this brings it a bit more up to date. That was sort of the past of tiny houses. This is Walter Siegel was Swiss, Austrian, Jewish refugee architect who was living in a big Victorian house in Highgate, was going to have it refurbished and needed somewhere for his family, he and his wife and 2 kids to live, and decided he would build himself a house in the garden, and ended up inventing a building system for people with very few building skills, was the idea. His idea was that you wouldn't need to cut anything. You would build in 8x4 sheets. In 8x4, every measurement would be a multiple of 8x4, because he wanted to take it all down again and sell them at the end. The building is still standing, it's been refurbished, and is now a Grade 2 listed building. Walter went on to do a number of not particularly tiny house developments, but self-build projects. The most well-known ones are in Lewisham, where the council back tend to build housing estates, where people off the housing waiting list built their own timber-framed houses using his method. It was, I built a sort of very large garden shed for a horticultural therapy project using Walter's original building method. It's a bit light on insulation, it's a bit drafty, which for a sort of horticultural work shed wasn't a problem. For a house, it would have left quite a lot to be desired these days. And once other architects took it after Walter died and tried to develop it so that it would meet current building regulations, it started to morph into something that wasn't as easy to build for people with no building skills. So, but there are, in fact, Peter Wilshaw is building one of these this weekend as a sort of office garden for somebody.
Is it his own in that style?
What?
Is his own house in that style?
It's that method sort of brought on the work that the architects did, which makes it much more complicated and much more a skilled job. Well, Walter was very good at, I'm told, I've talked to his son, Walter was very good at just going, and now hang a door. And as a carpenter, I know now hang a door is a nasty thing to say to somebody with no carpentry skills. Yes, you can screw a bit of plasterboard to the wall. Hanging a door is a bit more difficult.
It's a very 60s aesthetic as well, isn't it? It's kind of
Yes,
interior
yeah.
kind of stuff.
I mean, Walter was a modernist architect. I mean, quite clearly, he would have. Yeah. I did a bit of it. Park homes. I did a bit of investigation into the planning situation around park homes, and decided that the only reason that sort of I'd never paid any attention to it before was snobbery, really, is that I associate these with sort of very well-to-do retired home, sort of retirement complexes, and you can pay a lot of money for a park home. But actually, they're operating under what other people might call a loophole in the planning legislation, is that they're not built on land. You can build them on land that's not designated for planning. They fall somewhere between a caravan park and a housing estate, and they're more at the caravan park end. The legislation to do with them is very broad. And it sort of leads into sort of the sort of mobile home, tiny home sector, in that there's a specified floor area which is bigger than my house, so you're allowed to build a mobile home and a park home bigger than the small terraced house that I live in. They have to be theoretically movable in one or two pieces, so that's why you see half a park home going down the motorway. That's only theoretical. They don't actually have to move, and a lot of them never do. Or they only ever arrive and they never ever move again. And you can get 25-year renewable planning permission on land that's not zoned for housing. And I don't see why you couldn't build little eco houses. You might have to have a theoretical way that they came into two parts and you could theoretically move them, but there's no reason why you couldn't use the park home legislation. And they're not just in nice rural areas. There's one in Lancaster that's around the back of Whiteland, the big industrial estate. So if they don't, they can utilise all sorts of little bits of land. This is probably the most famous tiny home in any intentional community in the UK. It is the caravan at Findhorn, the famous caravan in the garden of giant vegetables set up in the 1960s. It had 3 adults and 3 children living in it. And what I I find interesting about Findhorn is that they've managed to become a sort of eco-village because they've gradually taken over a caravan site. They didn't, and that's essentially their status. And they've managed to get planning permission to build houses in little enclaves of it, but essentially their big advantage is they are essentially a caravan site. This is a replacement for a really old caravan. It's essentially an eco-mobile home. They did not need planning permission to build that, and they did not need building control to build that, because it's a replacement of like for like. They replaced a crappy old caravan with a very high-spec eco-mobile home, and they just did it because they demolished the caravan because there are no regulations that say that's not a replacement mobile home. And it's allowed them a huge amount of freedom about what they can do on the site. And I spent ages going, why has nobody used the park home caravan site legislation to do something more interesting? And then I realised that whilst this is the sort of Findhorn has the reputation of this sort of wacky, like New Age community, spiritual community, actually it's just a caravan site. And that's their big advantage from a planning point of view. Okay, so what do people think a tiny house looks like these days? If you troll the internet with tiny house, this is the sort of thing that comes. Mostly American. These are, but I get the impression that's what a lot of people in this country think. Something on a trailer that moves about. But why? I mean, it's clapperboard. It's almost classic American architecture. Why do we think that might be a mobile? Why not this? This is a Swedish. This is your Scandinavian architecture, tiny house.
Looks like a radiator.
Made out of folded cardboard.
Really?
Yeah. I have checked it out on their website. It does appear that it's waterproof, and you can erect it in sections, and it's made out of folded recycled cardboard.
Wow.
And yeah, it doesn't have to be a sort of shed with wings.
So what's the footprint of that one?
I don't know what the footprint of that one. It's not very big, I thought. But it's probably not far off the one previously, which is only a big trailer. And there's also, I mean, if you look at small I think you've got two sort of branches of the tiny house movement. You've got the architects who are designing wacky things like this, going, yeah, we can do stuff small. And you've got the sort of self-builders, which are more the other end, the glorified shed. Something you can imagine DIYing. This is one of the architects I came across, 3D printed house. And I'm not sure that this is actually a 3D printed house. And I think they might have made one to look like a 3D printed house, because on the same website there's an architect's impression of how it would be printed, rather than, I'm sorry, if they printed a house, I want to see the dirty great printer doing it. But they're going, this is technically possible, we could 3D print houses. Very different from the sort of shed on wheels. Or alternatively, this is Japanese style, in dirty grey concrete water pipes. And there again, I think this is conceptual. I'm not sure there's anybody living in these yet. They're 8-foot diameter sewage pipes, basically, that they've stuck an end on either end. Not sure how well insulated they are. Or are we talking, I love this picture, or are we talking about this? This is in America. This is a multi-storey caravan park.
Yeah.
Um, no, I don't.
Not very
How would you live? Yeah, I just think it obviously exists, and I mean the Americans have a whole long tradition of sort of trailer parks. They don't have council housing. They're poor white working class housing, just poor people's housing is trailer parks. So in some ways they're well ahead in terms of the concept of it, and probably in being able to find land and do tiny house developments.